I don't know who to dedicate the share to, but obviously for all the Cholim of Klal Yisrael. Before Kevin gets started, I read a proverb that was quite funny. It was in Proverbs chapter 24, verse 14. If you rise up very early in the morning and wake your friend with a wonderful blessing, your friend will consider it to be worse than receiving a curse. I thought that was very funny. It wasn't meant to be, but I'm not a morning person, so I could appreciate it. Kevin, teach us.
Okay, continuing with integrity and honesty in business. It says here, Rav Eliyahu Bakshi Daron, who was one of the previous Sephardi chief rabbis of Israel, says the following. The essential question posed to a soul in final judgment is merely, did a person conduct himself faithfully when relating to another Jew? Rather, the intent is much deeper, and it is to ask, when you conducted business with another individual, was it done with the faith in God? If indeed your faith in God is all embracing, then also your business dealings should be done with trustworthiness, because only Hashem determines the extent of your success. The demand that is impressed upon a believing Jew is, did you conduct your business with integrity? Not only did you conduct your business with integrity, but that your businesses should be guided by a belief in divine providence, and not just the ethical norm of fairness and truth which society requires. The belief in divine providence, that everything comes from his hand, totally changes the nature of business and the relational construct between people. In business done with integrity, there is not just the buyer and the seller. The main component is the belief in Hashem, that only His will shall decide the success and potential of the venture. And that comes from Binyan Av, Siman 76.
Okay. Thank you, Kev. All right, let's get started, guys. So now we're discussing a slightly different issue in the Gemara about how do we calculate multiple payments? No, in terms of the salience liability. So Tana taught in a brisa, and all of them are paid, even where there's payment for physical damage. Because how did this argument or discussion even came about is that even though the assailant must pay a large sum of money for the permanent physical damage he inflicted, he remains potentially liable to the 4 other payments as well. And in other words, we don't say that the 4 other categories are subsumed by the payment for the damage itself, even though the damage itself is a huge payment, especially if there's permanent damage. We're going to discuss in another daf temporary damage, but the default position is that it is permanent. So although our Mishnah already stated that the assailant is subject to 5 categories of payment, we could have thought that it was simply enumerating possible payments, and that it wouldn't necessarily be the case that you'd be liable for all 5 at once. So the brisa has to teach that the assailant must pay all the categories that are applicable in each and every assault, meaning in one juncture. So where do we get the particular, Chumash ordinance for the actual physical damage? It's from Shmot, Exodus chapter 21, verse 25. And we learn, how do we learn this? In other words, from which dictum? The Gemara answers, Rav Zavid said in the name of Rava, the verse states a wound in place of a wound. Okay, and that's obviously in the verse in Shmot. And why does it have a fancy way of saying it? Because you could just say a wound for a wound. It's to teach that an assailant can be obligated to give compensation for pain, even where he's already obligated to pay for damage. Because as we said, you could say, okay, well, you've paid for damage, and if you've paid back the person for the organ that they've lost use of, you've paid. What do you mean you've got to pay for pain? So we have to learn, we learned before that there's pain that's paid and humiliation. But the way it says the wound in place of a wound, it teaches you another valuable lesson, that it's coming to include an unintentional act like a deliberate one, and an unwilling act like a willing one. So what you've got to bear in mind here is that there's a common thing that people say, which drives me mad. They say, I'm sorry. They do something wrong, they say, I'm sorry. It's nice to have an apology, but people seem to think that an apology is meant to replace the sort of damage caused when it's not. You accept the apology and you also want to get paid for the damage that's done. They're two separate things. The one is a kapara for intent, and the other one is a payment at which restitution is made. So the term shoigeg means unintentional compared to mazid. Mazid means deliberate. And you've got ones, which is an unwilling damage, compared to ratzon willing. So what's unwilling is that you're kind of forced to do it, but you've gotten yourself in that particular situation. So, for example, if you go on Yom Kippur, there's a sin for lying when you got yourself in a predicament and you wanted to get yourself out of trouble. Now, what are you? That's not as bad as lying when you had no reason to do it, but you got yourself in a situation which kind of forced you to lie. So although you were unwilling, it is a sin, because if you hadn't got yourself in those circumstances, you never would have lied to start with. So there's no such thing as unavoidable, unintentional. You have to pay either way. So the phrase teaches the wound in place of a wound, and you can derive from it two laws. And those two laws is, number one, that you're liable for damage even when it's inflicted unintentionally or unwillingly. I think the word unintentional is probably better one as opposed to unwilling, because nobody generally forces you at gunpoint. And number two, that a person remains potentially liable for pain. And the other three categories, medical bills, recuperation, and humiliation, even when there's payment for damage. And we don't say that they're subsumed by the payment for damage. So that's why you learn in place of a wound. Okay? So the Gemara has to present an explicit source for the third payment. Rav Papa said in the name of Rava, the verse states in Shmot chapter 21, verse 19, and heal, he shall heal. So, and that requires an assailant to give compensation for healing, where he's obligated to also pay for damage. Now, what we learned yesterday is that we learned there was a separate reason for the word, and heal, he shall heal. What was that reason, guys? There were two reasons. Let me see if you guys remember. I think Arthur's talking to his client. If he's listening with half an ear, but God willing. Gavin, do you have any idea of what we did yesterday when we said heal, he shall heal? What were the two things that came to teach us?
And he shall heal. Now that phrase you mean?
Yeah, heal, he shall heal. It doesn't use the word heal twice. Generally, when the pasuk uses a double word, we say that it's superfluous and it's coming to teach you something, because the word heal is needed to teach you you're paying for healing. But why does it use could use the word heal? Why does it say heal, he shall heal? What two lessons does it come to teach us? Both of them.
I can have a guess. I'm not.
A guess at this stage is better than what anybody's come up with thus far. So you're ahead of the game.
Okay, so maybe if he shall heal,
in mind, so
it may mean that there won't be any damages, because it'll be as you were. The wound will heal, and the guy will the afflicted person will eventually be his status, his physical status will be back to where it was before the injury, and possibly there won't be then the assailant may not. I'm not saying I'm right. Possibly won't have to pay damages.
Okay. So
if they heal, if it like what I healed after my accident, I'm like fully.
Okay, so to answer your question, Kevin, you need to discern between the Gomorrah's classic case and your case. You never sustained permanent injuries. So what had to happen is that the assailant that rode into you had to pay for medical bills, but there wasn't permanent disability. that he had to pay for. In other words, you never lost your ability to earn a living. You needed time to recover. So he could have paid you for loss of income, and he could have paid you for pain, and he could have paid you for medical bills. But there was no humiliation, there was no ill intent, and there was no permanent disability. So that isn't paid. So that's not going to sort out the pasuk. Gavin, what are the two reasons? Heal and he shall heal. All right, can I give you?
The part? No, it might be. I don't remember this specifically, but is this the part when a person doesn't look after their wounds correctly and that type of thing?
Excellent. So,
And
Gavin,
they're negligent, you mean, Gavin?
So if they're negligent in looking after the wounds, then who's responsible? Is it the attack? What's it called? Yeah, the attacker
It's
or
the assailant.
or the assailant.
well, the assailant is the attacker or the victim. So, Gavin's right. There are three.
The attacker or the victim. Yeah.
There are three opinions. There's the Bava Kamma, there's Rav Yehuda, and there's the rabbis. But in principle, if a wound reoccurs, not from excessive bandaging, but from reasonable bandaging, because the difficulty is that if you don't bandage, infection could set in, and also there's a huge amount of pain in the northern hemisphere exposed to the cold with a wound. So you can bandage, but you shouldn't excessively. So what might happen as a result is the heat and infection could set in where the wound would reoccur. In other words, it looks like it's healing, but it comes back. That's considered reasonable by the rabbis. Why? Because who caused the injury in the first place, Gavin? The assailant. And therefore, had he not assaulted the victim, there would never be a reoccurrence of an injury that wasn't caused in the first place by the assailant. So as long as there's not excessive negligence and an infection could set in, he's entitled to bandage the wound. Excessive bandaging means he cuts off the circulation, which is damaging, or if he eats incorrectly because he causes diabetes and the wound doesn't heal, or if he doesn't follow the doctor's instructions, there's a problem. But even within reasonable care, sometimes reinfection can take place. And therefore, the assailant is responsible in that case. And that's why we learn, and heal, he shall heal. So if it looks like it's healing and the wound remanifests itself, the assailant has to pay. So exactly what Gavin said. Well listened. And Kevin, just to add to yours, is that and he shall heal is to teach us two principles. There was a case with the Rambam's son who wrote a book about how do we view God's will in the world. There are Seventh-day Adventists that don't take blood transfusions. Well, their thing is that you can't, the body of J.C. Penney or whatever, it's holy and you can't get a blood transfusion and all of that sort of nonsense. But there is a real concept that's saying, well, maybe it's God's will that a person gets sick, and therefore who are we to intervene? If we trust his will, it's his will. And the term, and he shall heal, teaches us that if an assailant injured the victim, we have to have mankind intervention of a physician to heal the victim. But the word, and he shall heal, is to teach us a different principle. If somebody gets a disease, through no assault due to mankind, but just a disease, that mankind has to use every physical measure at its disposal to interfere with the natural course of events where he could die from infection. Meaning that if Hashem has given us the brain to learn about medicine and certain remedies, we are to take those opportunities. And any negligence will be responsible for the loss of our own lives if we don't take prudent measures. So we have to intervene. Whereas certain religious people think it's an intervention shows a lack of faith in God's will. And the Gemara is teaching, no, that's not the case. So it's teaching two principles there. Firstly, if an assailant hurts his victim, we would think, okay, you can intervene then, but not if a disease took hold of a person. The Gemara is saying, no. Even if it looks natural, even if it looks like God's divine will, do everything in your power to supersede that. And the second principle is if a wound reoccurs, that the assailant has to pay, providing the victim wasn't excessively negligent. He's entitled to cover his wound. So the Gemara persists and says, well, if you're learning it about this physician that should heal, why is it still needed for that which we said above? In other words, for the verse to repeat the payment of healing. That is, he shall heal is needed to teach the assailant is liable for sores that develop because of the wound. In other words, if Rava certainly follows the Tanaic opinion quoted in the Brisa, and he doesn't use the word heal, he shall heal to tell of the Rav Yishmael's exegesis, which means Rav Yishmael's academy is teaching us that, listen, you need to have a medical intervention and you don't have to go with divine will of your perception that you're meant to just succumb to your illnesses at all. So if Rava doesn't hold by that, and he holds by the Tanaic opinion, that you have to heal sores that develop as a result of the wound that the assailant inflicted, and that the assailant has to pay a second time if infection set in, providing there's no negligence on the part of the victim, how can you use it for both? In other words, if it's so that it teaches only about liability for sores, why doesn't the verse say, the Gemara says, either heal, heal? In other words, use the double word, refuah. In other words, why does it use the word he shall heal? Or why don't you use the term he shall heal, he shall heal? Why in the first part does it use the word heal, as in refuah, and why in the second part does it use the word he shall heal, to convey he shall surely heal? So learn from it that the change in expression, that the assailant is required to give compensation for healing, where he's also obligated to give damage. In other words, it's possible to derive two laws from the word heal, he shall heal, from the repetition that we learn that an assailant is liable for healing sores that develop from a wound. And since the repeated words are not identical, we have to also derive a second lesson in that even though you are paying for the physical damage, you still have to pay for the other three categories included healing. And that's not covered in this initial assessment for physical damage. In other words, you don't pay one payment and get off the hook. Okay? So then it's saying, all right, but then we learn something else as well, is that if we learn that you need a special scriptural exegesis for the fact that if you pay for damages, you're also paying for healing, pain, and humiliation and medical bills, it obviously, guys, follows by implication that when you don't have to pay for permanent physical damage, that you have to pay for medical bills, pain, and healing and recovery. That's an obvious thing. So the Gemara gives an example for each category. So what is pain? Pain is the case, for example, where if you say there's no physical manifestation of the pain, you have to pay for that. What Gemara term does it use? It says he burnt him with the spit or injured him with a nail, even on his fingernail, meaning it didn't leave a permanent disfiguration or inability to use that limb, but it is very sore. And in that case, even though it doesn't make a wound, the assailant has to pay the victim for pain. What's the other three categories? If we look at healing, just healing on its own without damage, pain, or humiliation is where somebody was hurt and the assailant brought him a caustic ointment and it bleached the victim's flesh. So what's the problem if it bleached his flesh? Is that somebody could think that the victim had saras, which is caused from lashon hara and multiple sins. So now he's got to fix that victim's flesh, because it's not just about the physical permanent damage, it's that he can't have the victim being seen as somebody that's deserving of saras. So he has to then pay for a potion to restore the color of the flesh. So there we're talking about healing, even if there isn't permanent damage, like what Kevin had. Okay, then a loss of employment. And we even take it so as far as to use a different example. Say somebody has to go to work that day and he's got a business meeting or he's got multiple things to do, and somebody accidentally locked him in the bathroom or in the closet. He has to pay his loss of income for that day. Now, it's not like he's got permanent injuries, but he's stopped him from working, and therefore the victim has to be compensated for the loss of income, even though he wasn't injured at all. Now, we're saying there that his loss of income as an employee, or as his daily wage would be if you take it on a monthly basis and divide it by 30 or 31 days. We're saying, though, if a person is a merchant, Gavin, this is interesting. We cannot restore his income because he might not have made sales that day. Who's to say how much he really would have earned? So the Gemara seems to penalize when one has got their own business. And we see this with the Credit Act, by the way. If you're applying for finance, in the old days, they would reward you for an entrepreneurial spirit if you had your own business. And today, the Credit Act rather prefers an employee that's got a guaranteed salary every month than somebody in their own business as far as credit is concerned. You know that, Kev?
Mm.
So we're saying, by the way, not everybody agrees with that opinion, because Rosh explains that only if somebody physically put him in the room and locked the door. But if he accidentally locked the door, then he doesn't have to pay because it was an accident. It wasn't as if he put him in, because it's considered groma, which is indirect. He stopped him from getting out, but he never pushed him in the room. If the guy was in the room, Kev, you're falling asleep. Arthur's chatting to his client, you're asleep, and please God, we get married for this some other reason. I don't understand, but anyway.
I am listening.
God willing. So, Kevin, if you shove somebody in a room and lock the door, you have to pay them for loss of income, but not if you accidentally lock the door, according to the Rosh. According to many other opinions, if you've cost the person their money, you have to pay them for the day. So that's about shevet, loss of income. And humiliation, guys, can you give me an example when there'd be humiliation when there's no physical injury? Arthur would know. He's done the daf with Rabbi Kamma.
According to the Gemara, humiliation.
Well, you could give me any example where there's no physical injury.
Okay, where you, let's say, for example, you bring up something when you were 10 years old that he was naked and it embarrasses him.
Yeah, I think if you caused them humiliation, exactly that
Yeah.
way. Well, certainly on Yom Kippur, you'd be. If you take somebody that's a bolshev and said, "I remember in the old days when you were a sinner," that's a big no. To
Yeah,
spit in somebody's
not a guy
face.
riding his speed on his bike, but obviously let's not
Yeah.
talking about that.
No, we're not talking about physical injuries by cutting his brakes off. We're talking about like spitting in his face, pulling his pants down, or anything that can create humiliation. There's payment for that. Gavin, there's definitely payment for that.
Does this tie into when the two men are fighting and the wife of one of them grabs the man by his privates? That is this for that?
No, it's different there because that creates a physical injury as well. So we're saying, where is there a case where there's humiliation, where there's no physical injury? When you embarrass somebody by making sure that they're not seen as the same level of high esteem, maybe in their career, or spitting in their face, or showing their nakedness, exactly that. But if a wife to defend her husband had to grab another guy's privates, she'd certainly injure him, especially if she had nails. So
can I just make a comment? Lashon hara is if the person finds out about it, is complete humiliation.
Absolutely, and it can sully their reputation. So that is a payable act, Gavin, exactly. So the Gemara now delineates the fourth category of payment, the loss of employment. So we view the victim, as Arthur said yesterday, as though he were a watchman of cucumbers. So the rabbis taught in the Brisa, what sort of justice is this? In other words, justice is thereby stricken if you say he's a watchman of cucumbers. Why? Because maybe it's not fair for the injured party to be paid only for the wage of a cucumber watchman during his layoff when he'll be able to earn much more afterwards. So that's a discussion that Rashi brings. And the answer to that is that the Brise's question concerns only the future, after the victim heals, because the Gemara's language is talking about a future tense. In other words, maybe the Gemara is saying that the victim can earn a much more profitable employment in the future than a cucumber field watchman. We're not worried, guys, about the past, because the Mahashal is saying that as far as the past is concerned, is that essentially in the actual nezek damages, he gets paid out for what he could do before and what he's no longer able to do. So that's in the actual damages itself, Kevin, with permanent injury. Okay? So what we're saying is here, what happens if it doesn't affect his permanent earnings? So, for example, he makes jewelry with his hands, but his foot was injured. So why should he be paid for his loss of employment as a watchman of a cucumber field, when in fact he should be paid as a jeweler, because by having a gammy foot, he can still work with fine hand motor coordination because his hands weren't injured in the process. So why should he be paid less? And that's why they say maybe justice is travailed. We're not saying that he doesn't get compensated for permanent disability in the actual payment. We're saying what he can earn in future in his recovery should be paid, because maybe he's not injured to the degree where he's no longer able to do what he can currently do. And that should be taken in the shevet, actual recuperation. Okay? So that's what the Gemara is saying. And the Gemara says, look, when this person recovers from his illness, he won't be able to take the low wages of a cucumberman watchman. Why? Because maybe he can draw water from wells, even if he's slightly retarded as a result of the brain hemorrhage. Or maybe he can be a messenger and take higher wages. What do we mean a messenger? If his hands were cut off, he'd still be able to earn money as a messenger when he recovers, because that earns far more than a cucumber watchman. So he's not actually able to fulfill his full compensation. And if his foot was cut off, he could still work as a drawer of water until he recovers from his illness. So what do we do in that case? So the Gemara says, look, in most cases, it's not a problem, because very few people with the sort of pain that they're going to undergo in recovery are going to earn what they could earn before. So we don't have to pay them that, because their wounds will be excruciating. And as far as justice is stricken is concerned, the assailant already gave him the value of his hand or the value of his foot, meaning he never lost out at all. In other words, even when the victim recovers, he won't be able to work at more lucrative jobs. Why? Because of the pain factor. And the higher praise of his physical damage works both ways. Let me give you an example. Say he was a person that earned a lot of money with the use of his hand, and now he repaired watches, for example, or he was a scrub, or he was a jeweler. When he loses his hand, there's a huge payment up front, a large cash reward, because of the permanent physical disability. And therefore, when he loses that hand, he will be limited to guarding cucumbers. So the shevet, the recovery rate for his injuries, is lower, because he's now can no longer do the same task as fixing jewelry. So in other words, the initial reward of cash is high, because he's now got permanent disability. So the recovery rate is low, because that's all he can do now that he's got that injury. Now, if his earning potential hasn't been limited, he earns a much lower cash settlement initially, because he's not barred from doing his work. So his foot's injured, but he uses his hand in terms of his career as a surgeon. He's paid a very low permanent disability wage, because he hasn't been prevented from earning at his daily skilled task. However, his recovery rate is higher, because he's not able to stand on his foot until he fully recovers. So therefore, that recovery will be quite high. Do you see how it's balanced in the Gemara, guys? According to Tosfot. Guys?
Yeah, I heard you.
But can you give it over to me in terms of the balance?
You said that what we were talking about. If I can remember what we were talking about, then I can tell you with pleasure. Kevin, just give me a hint. What Kevin's falling asleep. I was listening. Damon, just tell me what the last sentence you said, and I'll finish it for you.
All I'm saying is that if a guy's a menial laborer, okay?
Yes, okay, I got it. Okay, I got it. I just needed a reminder. Okay, so what we're talking about here is a guy whose foot got, a guy who's like a jewelry operator, a surgeon or a jewelry operator, and he does fine tuning with his hands, and he needs his hands to operate, and his foot gets damaged. If his foot gets damaged, it's it's only going to give him a temporary sort of out of work, like recovery period. So for that recovery period, he'll actually get paid out a premium, because once his leg recovers, he will be able to stand on his foot and do jewelry and be able to do surgery. But while his foot's messed up the way it is, he's incapacitated to do that type of work. So that's why. Whereby if you take a guy who, if you cut off his hands, then you got the recovery period is forever, basically. He never recovers. So you've got a different scenario.
Correct. So what Gavin's saying is perfect. What he's saying is it emerges from Rashi and Tosfot's explanation that a skilled worker, like a jeweler, the payment for physical damage, like a severed leg, will be small, since he can regain his livelihood after he recovers. However, that payment for loss of employment during the illness will be very large, because he earns 60 grand a month as a jeweler, and you have to pay him for 3 months while his leg's recovering. You're going to sweat bullets paying him for 3 months worth of labor. But your initial physical permanent handicap damage is small, because he can carry on working as a jeweler. So that's balanced. Now, if you happen to cut off his hand, your physical liability charge will be huge. It might be R1 million or something. But because he's lost his hand, you only have to pay him now as a cucumber watchman, because he can't get back his living as a jeweler. So while he's recovering from his hand to recover the wound, you might only be paying 2,000 Rand a month as a cucumber watchman, and he takes 3 months to recover. But you paid R1 million in capital disability. Exactly that, Gavin. Exactly as Gavin said. So it's balanced. That's what Tosfot and Rashi is saying. It's all balanced. The only time it's not balanced is they say it's very difficult to calculate somebody that is a merchant, because we can't assess what he could have profited during an illness by buying and selling, because there's no way to know if he would have been successful. He's then generally at a disadvantage as far as that's concerned. Okay? And also somebody that's either very wealthy that doesn't work, or somebody that's lazy, you don't pay anything for loss of employment, because they're not currently working, whether or not they're unemployed or not. The truth of it is you never deprive them of the income. So the moral of the story is you better be working when you get hit by a truck. That's all I'm saying. And they're saying, well, surely he could do a better labor than a cucumber watchman, but then he got paid in the capital disability case. And most of the time they're saying that it uses a cucumber watchman because people are in such agony after the injury. Even if it could be assessed that they could do better, most people need that recovery time, and they're not able to afterwards immediately get back and do something quite difficult as becoming a messenger and running around and having that sort of shock in the body, or drawing water or things like that, because that does take a shock on the body. So the Gemara elaborates on the payment for loss of employment. Just see how long we've got, guys. We've got about 4 minutes. Yeah. So if the assailant cut the victim's hand or damaged it, the assailant must give him the value of the hand. And regarding compensation for loss of employment, we view the victim as though he was guarding cucumbers. If the assailant then broke the victim's foot, the assailant must give him the value of the foot. And regarding the loss of employment, we view the victim as though he was guarding the entrance. What do you mean guarding the entrance? Well, he can't watch cucumbers because you have to walk around the field to watch it. So if the guy doesn't have a foot anymore, he's paid as a doorman, which pays even less than a cucumber watcher, believe it or not. But there's no problem there, because the amount you've paid him for the leg is going to be astronomical. If the assailant blinded his victim eye, he must give him the value of his eye. And regarding the loss of employment, we view the victim as though the assailant made him grind at the millstone. What does this mean? Is that he has to pay him, because as a millstone, you don't need your eyes, you need to use your feet. But now all the schlep of taking the person to the job, this assailant has to pay. Now, this is the interesting part. If the assailant made his victim deaf, he must pay the victim his total value as though he was a dead man. That was Arthur saying yesterday. So it's worse to be, in the Gemara term, deaf than blind, because a deaf person isn't fit for any work. He can't take instructions. He's regarded as a dead man since he's lost all his worth as a slave because he can't take instructions. He's paid the total value of his life for physical damage and nothing for loss of employment. Why for loss of employment? If you've paid millions of rand for what his life would be worth, you've paid him out for like a death benefit. So you don't have to pay for loss of employment. The fact of it is, I don't quite understand, Arth, why the boss can't write down instructions if the guy can't hear it. And number two, very funny. But they had to call in a pen then. But Arth, the reality is being blind is worse. Because what are you going to do as a blind person? You can't see your way around. At least if a person's deaf and says, go clean up the kitchen, you can wash dishes. I don't understand why being blind when you can't even find the knife, you can't clean a knife because you could cut your hand, or the soap suds, or what. Being blind is worse. I don't see why here they pay the capital death benefit for a person that's deaf, and if it's blind, he's paid far less. I don't get it, guys. Maybe you can explain it to me. I don't understand.
No, I also don't. I wouldn't want to be either, but I think if you can see 10 times better off, you can function, you can move around the world, you can go.
I used to have a deaf graphic designer.
Drive,
She's really good.
Yeah, yeah, she was quite a pretty girl, if I remember that deaf graphic. Wasn't she quite pretty?
Yeah, but yeah, she was okay, but she's.
Who was the pretty one that worked for you?
Oh, the blondie. One of my clients used to come around and just look at her.
No, he married her. Didn't he marry her? The clown?
No, he married her. I'm still on Facebook with her. She's doing well.
Oh, cool.
So contact every now and again, so she's doing.
All right, guys, listen, we did 4 pages, which is pretty good. We flew through it.
Up to what page did you finish, Damon?
We've finished 85B3.
Ah, okay.
And we were on 85A before.
Well, the next one is, you're not allowed to hit children, Dave. You're not allowed to hit children. Even
Yeah, let me get there first. Guys, have a wonderful Shabbos, eh? Have a wonderful Shabbos.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers. Thanks.